The morning disruption. The early morning fog hadn't yet lifted when Dylan Matthews was awoken by a sound that didn't belong to his otherwise peaceful suburban neighborhood. His alarm had yet to go off, and the usual quiet was punctured by an unusual clatter coming from next door. Groggy and irritated, Dylan rolled over in his bed, squinting at the clock on his nightstand. 7:30 a.m. It was far too early for any noise, especially not the kind of commotion that seemed to be happening just beyond his window. He was used to the hum of everyday life, the rustling of leaves, birds chirping, and the occasional laughter from the neighbors, but this noise wasn't of that nature. This was different. Something was happening at the house next door, and it sounded like a move-in of some sort. Boxes being lifted and carried, the low hum of conversations that drifted through the thin walls of his house. Dylan furrowed his brow, muttering to himself. "It's too early for this," he grumbled as he shoved the blanket off his legs. His house was a tidy little cottage nestled in the corner of Pine Hills, a neighborhood that prided itself on its serenity. The neighbors knew each other, kept their yards neat, and generally stayed out of each other's way. But new neighbors meant change, and Dylan wasn't a fan of it. Especially not when it disturbed his routine. Still half asleep, he padded over to the window and peered through the blinds. The house next door, which had been sitting vacant for several months, now seemed alive with activity. Two men, dressed in dark clothing, were standing on the porch, chatting with a third person who appeared to be helping them. The man seemed to be in charge, directing the flow of boxes as they were moved from the truck into the house. Dylan squinted harder. His eyes locked onto the man who stood with a commanding presence. He was black, tall, muscular, somewhere in his 40s, and his stature was imposing even from a distance. Dylan had never seen him before and felt his eyebrows furrow in skepticism. "New neighbors," he muttered again, this time with a hint of displeasure. He felt an odd sense of unease as he watched, though he couldn't understand why. As his gaze lingered, Dylan saw two police officers step out of the house, their uniforms crisp, badges gleaming in the morning light. The man, the one who seemed to be in charge, was talking to them, and there was something about the way they interacted, polite, cordial, even respectful. It didn't sit right with Dylan. His mind began to race with questions. Why were the police here? Had there been some kind of incident? Without even thinking it through, Dylan's irritation flared, and a rash judgment crept into his thoughts. This didn't seem right to him. What kind of person would move in like that, with the police involved, and still disrupt the peace so early in the morning? He watched as the police officers shook the man's hand before getting into their patrol cars. The man stood tall on his porch, seemingly unbothered, while the officers drove off. Dylan's frustration began to bubble over. His morning had already been disturbed, and the strange scene next door wasn't helping. "I don't need this," he muttered, rubbing his eyes in annoyance. "It's too early for this crap." Without giving it a second thought, Dylan opened the front door, stepped out onto his porch, and called out across the yard. "Hey, you! Black criminal!" His voice rang out, sharp and angry, as he waved a hand toward the man. "Keep it down, will ya? It's too early for all this noise. Don't make the cops come back and haul your ass off to jail." The man's head turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Dylan's, but his expression remained unreadable. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, giving nothing away. The two men who had been helping him were carrying boxes into the house, ignoring the scene, while the newcomer didn't flinch. Dylan, feeling emboldened by his own outburst, continued, "You think you can just show up and cause a ruckus? You're nothing but trouble waiting to happen." He felt a smug sense of satisfaction, certain that he had put the man in his place. After all, who was going to challenge Dylan Matthews, a lifelong resident of Pine Hills? He had lived here for decades, and his word was law. However, instead of retaliating with anger or hostility, the man stood silently, calmly adjusting a box on his porch. There was no response, no raised voice, just the sound of the man moving with a calm, controlled manner. Dylan's heart skipped a beat. Something didn't feel right. But instead of confronting it, he chose to shake off the discomfort and turned his back on the situation, walking back to his front door with a sense of vindication. "That's right," he muttered under his breath. "Knew you'd back down. Probably scared I'd call the cops again." He smirked to himself as he closed the door behind him, feeling like he had won in some way. But as he closed the door, his gaze fell upon something else. A large box had been left near the boundary of his property line, sitting just beyond his carefully manicured lawn. It wasn't his box, but the sight of it, imperfect, out of place, frustrated him. Dylan huffed, rolling up his sleeves as he marched toward the box. He kicked it with all his might, sending it tumbling across the pavement. "Get this filthy black trash off my land," he barked. His voice was filled with disdain, his eyes locked on the cardboard as if it were the source of his irritation. Just as the box came to a stop, the man, Zion, turned to face him. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was deep, calm, and unwavering. "Why are you damaging my property?" Zion asked, his tone gentle yet firm. Dylan's sneer deepened. He was ready to escalate the confrontation. "Your junk's on my side of the yard. I'm doing you a favor by getting rid of it," Dylan snapped. "You should be thanking me, not acting like I'm the bad guy here." Zion's expression remained unchanged, but there was something in his posture that suggested patience, a patience Dylan found grating. His voice, though quiet, held an undeniable weight as he continued, "I'm not asking for your help, Dylan." Dylan, convinced that the man was just trying to avoid conflict, pressed on. "Don't talk to me like that," he said, his voice rising with anger. "You're lucky I didn't do more than kick a box." Zion's jaw tightened, and his hands balled into fists, his immense frame now towering over Dylan. The air between them thickened with tension, crackling with the possibility of violence. Dylan's heart raced as he braced himself for a confrontation, certain that Zion would snap. He'd pushed too far, but Zion didn't react. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. In that moment, Dylan was certain Zion would strike him down with the same fury that burned in his chest, but instead, the man simply bent down and lifted the box off the ground. He carried it back toward the porch, walking past Dylan with an air of dignity that sent a wave of confusion through him. Dylan stood there for a moment, watching Zion disappear into his house. His chest tightened as he realized that Zion had chosen not to engage. He thought it was a victory, misinterpreting the man's restraint as fear. With a smug expression, Dylan turned back to his porch, feeling like he had won the battle. But in reality, he had only taken the first step towards something much bigger, something that he couldn't yet see. The man he had just insulted, the one he thought had backed down, was someone he would soon learn he had deeply underestimated. The unseen truth. The following days in Pine Hills were quiet, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Dylan Matthews had convinced himself that his encounter with his new neighbor, Zion, had ended in his favor. In his mind, Zion had been the one to retreat, to walk away in defeat. He couldn't shake the feeling of satisfaction that lingered after his harsh words and the smug sense of control that came with knowing the power of his neighborhood. After all, Dylan had been a resident of Pine Hills for over 20 years. He had earned his place here. He was one of the pillars of the community. Yet, something about Zion kept gnawing at him. There was a mystery that the man carried with him, something that made Dylan uneasy. It wasn't just his size or his demeanor, but the way Zion had reacted, or rather, not reacted. Most people would have fought back, at least verbally, but Zion had been calm, controlled, and indifferent to Dylan's insults. It made no sense to Dylan, who was used to people either standing up for themselves or retreating in fear when confronted by someone like him. The next morning, Dylan decided to confront his discomfort directly. As he sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, he glanced over at Zion's house. The place was still in disarray from the move-in, boxes scattered across the porch and items partially unloaded from the moving truck. Zion, as usual, was nowhere to be seen. Dylan had expected him to be working on his yard or organizing the rest of his belongings, but there was no sign of him. Dylan's eyes narrowed as he stared at the house, wondering what Zion was up to. The thought that Zion could be hiding inside or worse, planning something, troubled Dylan in ways he didn't fully understand. A few hours passed before Zion appeared. He was carrying a heavy toolbox in his hand, his broad shoulders visible through the open door. This time, Dylan was determined to get a clearer read on the man, to figure out what made him so different. He stood up, stretched, and wandered over to the boundary of his yard, where the two properties met. Zion, noticing him from across the yard, raised an eyebrow, but didn't acknowledge him directly. His calm demeanor was unnerving to Dylan. "Hey, Zion!" Dylan called out, his voice louder than necessary as he approached. "You got a moment?" He tried to sound casual, like someone making small talk with a neighbor, but there was an edge to his tone. Zion stopped what he was doing, looking up slowly. His eyes were unreadable, and Dylan felt a shiver run down his spine as those deep, dark eyes settled on him. Without a word, Zion walked over, the sound of his heavy boots thumping softly on the ground as he approached the property line. Dylan smiled, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Look, I just wanted to apologize for the other day," he said with a tone that was meant to be dismissive but still carried a hint of insincerity. "I was out of line. Got a little carried away, you know. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Zion studied him for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need your apology," Zion said simply, his voice steady. "I'm not here to make enemies." Dylan hesitated, trying to gauge the man's reaction. He had expected some sort of acknowledgement, something that would confirm Zion's awareness of his position in the neighborhood. But the lack of a response left Dylan feeling exposed, like he was talking to a wall. "You're a police officer, right?" Dylan asked, trying to gain some leverage. "I saw you talking to the cops when you moved in." He didn't want to admit it, but the more he thought about it, the more that moment intrigued him. Zion's calm interaction with the officers had seemed strange, out of place. Maybe Zion had some sort of connection with them, perhaps he was an officer himself. Zion's eyes flickered briefly, a slight narrowing of his gaze, but his expression remained stoic. "Not anymore," he said, his tone clipped, his eyes briefly glancing toward the horizon as if lost in thought. Dylan's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? Not anymore? What, you got fired or something?" He couldn't help but probe, his curiosity taking over. Zion paused for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Dylan with an air of quiet authority. "I left the force voluntarily. Not everyone stays in a job for life. Some of us move on," he said, his voice low but steady. There was something in his tone that suggested a much deeper story, one Dylan had no way of knowing. But that answer only raised more questions. Before Dylan could respond, Zion turned, his back to him as he walked back toward his porch. The conversation had ended just as abruptly as it had begun. "You should be careful what you say about people you don't know, Dylan," Zion called over his shoulder, his voice carrying just a hint of warning. "You never know who you're talking to." Dylan stood there, stunned. He wanted to retort, to shout something back, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Something about Zion's demeanor had shifted. There was a weight in the air now, something Dylan couldn't quite put his finger on. And for the first time since their first encounter, Dylan felt a sense of unease deep in his chest. That evening, after dinner, Dylan couldn't stop thinking about the exchange. Zion had left a mark on him, a mark of calm authority, a presence that spoke volumes without saying much at all. He decided to do a little digging, to find out more about his mysterious neighbor. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the more he thought about Zion, the more curious he became. Dylan fired up his computer and searched the local news archives for any mention of Zion. What he found made his stomach churn. Zion's full name was Zion Hayes, and he wasn't just any former police officer, he was the former chief of police for the entire town of Pine Hills. Dylan's heart raced as he read through the articles. Zion had served on the force for over 15 years, rising through the ranks from patrol officer to chief. But a few months ago, he had abruptly resigned, citing personal reasons. The town had been shocked at his departure, and there had been little follow-up after his resignation. The press had largely left the story alone, but there were rumors about corruption, about a scandal involving his sudden departure. Nothing concrete, just whispers. Dylan's mind was reeling. He had no idea that his new neighbor had been such a prominent figure. Zion was not just some random man, but the very man who had once held the town's highest position in law enforcement. The realization hit him hard. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. The next morning, as he sat on his porch sipping his coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that Zion had been playing a game, one that Dylan hadn't even realized he was part of. But what kind of game was it? And what did Zion want with him? These questions swirled in his mind as he looked over at the house next door, where Zion stood in the yard, staring back at him. This time, there was no smile, no greeting. Just that calm, unreadable expression, as if he knew exactly what Dylan had discovered. The tension between them was palpable now, thicker than ever. And for the first time, Dylan felt like the situation was out of his control. Something about Zion, something hidden beneath the surface, had changed the dynamics of their little suburban world forever. Dylan had no idea just how deep that change would run, or what kind of ripple effects would follow. But one thing was certain, the man he had so casually dismissed as a newcomer was far more than he appeared. The hidden past. As the days rolled by, the once peaceful rhythm of Pine Hills began to shift. The neighborhood, which had always been quiet, now felt charged with an undercurrent of tension. Dylan Matthews could no longer deny the truth that he had uncovered about his neighbor, Zion Hayes. Zion was not just some random man who had moved into the house next door, he was a former police chief, someone who had wielded power and influence within the very town where Dylan had lived for decades. At first, Dylan tried to push the thought aside. He convinced himself that it didn't matter who Zion had been, that the past was the past. But every time he glanced over at Zion's house, or saw him walking across his yard with that quiet, assured demeanor, something inside Dylan nagged at him. Zion had left the police force for reasons unknown, and the rumors of a scandal, however faint, lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow. Dylan knew he couldn't let it go, not now that he knew the truth. He spent the next few days observing Zion from a distance, his curiosity growing with each passing hour. Zion went about his daily routine with a stoic calm that seemed almost unnerving. He would spend hours in his yard, trimming hedges, fixing his car, or rearranging the boxes he'd moved in. He rarely spoke to anyone, even when neighbors waved at him. It was as though he had retreated into a world of his own, a world where he was unreachable. Dylan couldn't help but wonder what kind of man Zion really was. How had he risen to the rank of police chief? What had caused him to step down so abruptly? And most importantly, why had he chosen to move into this sleepy, nondescript neighborhood? Was it to escape something? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The questions gnawed at Dylan, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't just let it rest. He needed to know the whole story. So, one morning, as he sipped his coffee and watched Zion across the yard, Dylan decided to take matters into his own hands. He would pay a visit to the local library, dig through old records, and uncover the truth about Zion Hayes. Later that afternoon, Dylan walked into the Pine Hills Public Library, the small, quiet building tucked at the edge of town. The library was a far cry from the bustling urban libraries Dylan had been to in the past. Here, everything was calm, almost forgotten. He approached the front desk and greeted the librarian, a gray-haired woman who had worked there for as long as he could remember. "Can I help you, Mr. Matthews?" she asked with a smile. "I'm looking for some old police records," Dylan replied, trying to sound casual. "Something about a former police chief, Zion Hayes." The librarian's smile faded ever so slightly. "Zion Hayes," she repeated, her voice quieter. "What do you need to know about him?" Dylan frowned, sensing that there was more to her reaction than she was letting on. "I just want to know a bit about his time on the force. He moved in next door recently, and I'm curious about his history here." The librarian hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the side as if she was weighing something in her mind. Finally, she nodded and stood up from behind the desk. "All right. Follow me, Mr. Matthews," she said, leading him through the rows of bookshelves toward a back corner of the library. It was a small, dusty section of the building where the town's history was kept in yellowing files and old newspapers. She pulled open a drawer and started flipping through the records, her fingers moving quickly as she scanned the contents. Dylan's mind raced as he waited. He had no idea what he was about to uncover, but there was a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't just about a former police chief, there was something deeper here, something hidden beneath the surface. The librarian eventually stopped, pulling out a folder that looked as though it had been untouched for years. She handed it to Dylan without a word, her expression unreadable. Dylan opened the folder carefully, half expecting to find pages upon pages of mundane details about Zion's tenure on the police force. Instead, what he found was something far more unsettling. The folder contained a series of articles from local newspapers, each one more troubling than the last. The first article was about Zion's rise through the ranks of the Pine Hills Police Department. He had started as a rookie patrol officer, and quickly earned a reputation for being tough, but fair. He was promoted rapidly, first to sergeant, then lieutenant, and finally, at the age of 38, he was named the chief of police. Under his leadership, the department had seen significant improvements, crime rates dropped, community programs flourished, and the force was seen as one of the best in the state. But then came the scandal. A small headline at the bottom of the last page caught Dylan's attention: "Chief of Police resigns amid allegations of corruption." He scanned the article quickly, his eyes widening as he read. The report stated that Zion Hayes had stepped down unexpectedly, citing personal reasons. However, the article also mentioned a federal investigation into his actions, specifically surrounding allegations of bribery and abuse of power. The details were vague, but the article suggested that Zion had been involved in some shady dealings with local businesses and contractors, and there were rumors of illegal activities being covered up within the department. Nothing had been proven, but the investigation had been enough to force Zion's resignation. The next few pages were more of the same: rumors, speculation, and whispers of corruption that had never fully been substantiated. But it was enough. Zion's past was filled with secrets, and the more Dylan read, the more he realized that Zion wasn't just a former police chief. He was a man with a past that the town had wanted to forget. Dylan's hands trembled as he closed the folder. He could feel the weight of the information pressing down on him, and for the first time, he realized how much danger he might be in. Zion Hayes was no ordinary neighbor. He wasn't just trying to escape his past, he was trying to hide it. With the folder under his arm, Dylan walked back to his house, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do with the information he had just uncovered. He had hoped for some simple answer, some straightforward explanation for Zion's presence in Pine Hills. But now he knew the truth: Zion was here for a reason, and that reason had everything to do with what had happened before he left the force. The sun had set by the time Dylan reached his front door, and the streets of Pine Hills had grown quiet once again. But the peace he once felt had vanished. His mind was no longer focused on the small-town life he had always known, it was consumed with the mystery of Zion Hayes and the secrets buried in his past. As he looked across the street at Zion's house, he realized that his life, his quiet suburban life, was about to be shaken in ways he couldn't yet understand. The man next door was far more than a neighbor, he was a force to be reckoned with, and Dylan had just stumbled upon a piece of the puzzle that could destroy everything. The questions were no longer just about who Zion was. Now, the question was, what was he going to do about it, the breaking point? Dylan couldn't sleep that night. His thoughts raced, like an unrelenting river surging through his mind, washing away any semblance of peace he had once held. The more he thought about Zion Hayes, the more the man's presence seemed to overshadow his life, like an inevitable storm on the horizon. Everything Dylan had believed about his quiet, predictable life in Pine Hills seemed to be unraveling, piece by piece, with every new detail he discovered about his neighbor. The weight of the folder, the hidden truths about Zion's past, clung to him like a heavy cloak. It wasn't just the corruption allegations, the whispers of bribery and misconduct, it was the fact that Zion's resignation had been surrounded by so much secrecy. The town had wanted to forget about him, bury the story under layers of silence, and move on. But Dylan couldn't forget. He couldn't ignore the possibility that Zion had left the force for a reason far more complicated than what the public had been told. Dylan tossed and turned in bed, his mind fixated on that cold, unreadable face of Zion. What was he really doing in Pine Hills? Why had he chosen this small, quiet town to settle in? What was Zion hiding, and was he still a threat to the very community that had once trusted him? At dawn, Dylan decided he could no longer sit idly by, hoping for answers to fall into his lap. If he wanted to know the truth, he needed to confront Zion directly. He had to understand who this man was, what drove him, and whether or not the rumors about his past were more than just rumors. Dylan was no longer content to sit in the shadows, watching from his window. He had to face Zion head-on. Without thinking, Dylan slipped into his clothes and walked out the front door. The morning air was crisp, still carrying the remnants of night's chill, but there was a weight to it now, an unease that settled into the very bones of the neighborhood. As Dylan walked across his yard, he noticed that Zion's house seemed eerily quiet. No sign of movement, no sounds of the usual morning routine. Dylan approached the boundary of their properties, where the fence that separated them stood like a silent wall between their lives. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Was there even a way to open a conversation with Zion without making it clear that Dylan had been digging into his past? Would Zion even be willing to talk to him? Dylan had no idea, but one thing was certain, he was determined to find out. Taking a deep breath, Dylan called out, his voice clear and louder than necessary. Zion. It wasn't until the second call that Zion emerged from the side of the house, his tall figure looming over the yard like a silent sentinel. His eyes met Dylan's, still as unreadable as before, but this time, there was a slight narrowing of his brow. He didn't speak immediately, just stood there, sizing Dylan up, waiting for him to continue. Dylan swallowed hard, trying to force the words out, but they caught in his throat. It felt like every syllable he spoke weighed 1,000 pounds. "We need to talk," Dylan said finally, his voice strained, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Zion or himself. Zion stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "What's this about, Dylan?" His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he already knew what Dylan was going to say. Dylan wasn't sure how to start, but he pushed forward. "I know who you are. I know what happened with the police department, why you resigned." His words were direct, unflinching, though a hint of uncertainty lingered in his tone. "I'm not here to accuse you, but I need to understand. You're not just some guy who moved in. There's more to you than that. Why are you really here?" For a moment, Zion said nothing, his expression unreadable, his body stiffening slightly. Dylan felt a chill in the air, an unsettling silence settling between them. He wasn't sure if Zion was going to walk away, shout at him, or even turn violent, but he knew this moment couldn't be avoided any longer. Then, slowly, Zion spoke. His words were deliberate, almost measured, as if he was choosing each one with care. "You've been digging, haven't you?" Dylan tensed. "I had to know. The town was never the same after you left. People stopped talking about you, like you never existed. But you did. You were important." Zion's eyes softened just a fraction, though the tension in his posture didn't relax. "I didn't want to leave. The Force meant everything to me at one point. But things change. People change." He paused, as if collecting his thoughts. "And I'm not the man I was when I took that job." Dylan furrowed his brow, not fully understanding. "What happened, Zion? Why did you step down? Was it really just personal reasons?" Zion inhaled sharply and exhaled slowly, his gaze not leaving Dylan. The silence between them stretched out, heavy and thick, before he spoke again, his voice low but steady. "I'll tell you this, nothing's ever as simple as it seems. The people who know the truth, they're not talking. And the people who talk, they don't know anything at all." Zion's words hung in the air, laced with an air of finality. "I'm here because I need to be. I've got a job to do. One that doesn't involve you, or anyone else in this town. But if you're really asking why I left the Force, maybe it's because I didn't want to become the man they said I was." Dylan stared at him, his confusion growing. "What does that mean? You just left? Walked away from everything?" Zion's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "It's complicated. And it's not something I want to explain to you." Dylan's frustration surged, and he stepped forward, his voice rising in pitch. "I deserve to know the truth. You don't get to just come here and pretend like nothing happened. You owe this town an explanation, and you owe me one too." For the first time since their encounter, Zion's expression shifted. His stoic facade cracked, revealing a flicker of something sharp, something dangerous, beneath. He was no longer the calm, collected man that Dylan had seen. In this moment, Zion seemed to exude a raw intensity that made Dylan take a step back. "You don't know what you're asking for, Dylan," Zion said, his voice low but filled with a quiet fury. "You think you want the truth? You don't know the half of it." The tension in the air thickened. The quiet of the neighborhood seemed to amplify the weight of Zion's words. Dylan felt a chill run down his spine as the intensity of the conversation grew, realizing just how little he understood about the man standing in front of him. Zion had a past that was far darker and more complicated than Dylan could have ever imagined. But one thing was clear now, Zion Hayes was not a man to be underestimated. Dylan tried to compose himself, swallowing his rising panic. He wanted to press for more answers, but he knew better than to push further. There was something about Zion that suggested this conversation wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. Zion turned abruptly, his body language signaling that the conversation was at an end. "You've made your choice," he said quietly, not looking back. "Now, live with it." With those final words, Zion disappeared inside his house, leaving Dylan standing there, shaken and unsettled. He had come looking for answers, but all he had found was more confusion, more darkness. And now, Dylan knew, more than ever, that the storm was coming. And when it did, nothing in Pine Hills would ever be the same again. The unraveling. Dylan didn't sleep that night. His mind churned with everything that had transpired between him and Zion. The encounter on the front lawn was like a door that had been cracked open, but beyond it was a darkness that Dylan wasn't sure he was prepared to face. Zion's words haunted him, "You don't know the half of it." There was a depth to Zion's past, a complexity to the man himself, that Dylan could barely begin to grasp. But it wasn't just about Zion anymore, it was about Pine Hills, too. This town, this quiet little place that had once seemed so safe, was now riddled with secrets that Dylan couldn't ignore. The next morning, Dylan went about his routine mechanically, the events of the previous day lingering in the background like a dull throb in his chest. He tried to pretend like everything was normal, that things hadn't changed. But how could they? How could anything be the same after what he had learned? It wasn't just Zion's past that worried him, it was his presence. Zion was no longer just a neighbor, he was a force within Pine Hills, a man who had held power and still carried the weight of that power even after leaving the police force. His calm demeanor, his silence, were all part of the mask he wore, a mask that Dylan had started to see through. The more he thought about it, the more Dylan realized that Zion's decision to leave the force hadn't been as simple as stepping away. It had been a deliberate choice, one made for reasons Dylan couldn't yet understand. The people who had whispered about Zion, the ones who had whispered about the investigation and the scandal, had all vanished. There were no clear answers. It was all just a fog, a collection of rumors and half-truths. Dylan knew he couldn't keep going like this. He had to learn more. But as he began making plans to dig deeper, a thought settled in the back of his mind: what if some truths were better left uncovered? For the next few days, Dylan kept to himself. He stayed out of sight, retreating into the comfort of his own home, trying to pretend that he hadn't stepped into a world far larger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. But his curiosity was insatiable, and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right kept pushing him forward. He couldn't shake the image of Zion, his stillness, his silence, his unwavering calm. It felt like something was brewing, something far beyond the boundaries of Pine Hills. One evening, Dylan sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the papers he had found at the library. The headlines blurred in front of his eyes as he searched for something he had missed, some hint of the truth he had failed to see before. He had already gone over the files a dozen times, but still, no answers. There was something missing. Some piece of the puzzle that wasn't in the public records. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, loud and insistent. Dylan's heart jumped in his chest, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he wondered if Zion had come to confront him. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Zion standing there, it was a man he didn't recognize, a sharp-dressed man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Matthews?" The man's voice was smooth, with a cold edge to it. Dylan narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm Agent Thomas Caldwell. I'm with the Federal Task Force investigating the case of Zion Hayes. I'd like to speak with you." Dylan froze. The blood drained from his face as a wave of dread washed over him. The investigation. It had been real after all. He hadn't imagined it. Zion hadn't just walked away from the force. He had been forced to leave, forced because of something far more dangerous than Dylan had known. Agent Caldwell stepped forward, his eyes scanning Dylan's face for any sign of hesitation. "I need you to come with me," he said. "There's a lot you don't know about your neighbor, and you might be in more danger than you realize." The words hit Dylan like a punch to the stomach. He had no idea how to respond. His mind reeled, trying to process everything, the agent, the case, the way Zion had spoken of the investigation, but there was no time to think. Before he knew it, he was in the back of a car, heading to a government facility on the outskirts of town, the weight of the world settling on his shoulders. The facility was small, tucked away on a dead-end road that most people would never think to visit. It was unmarked, a place that seemed almost forgotten by time itself. The air inside was cold, sterile, and clinical, the walls white and unadorned. Agent Caldwell led Dylan down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Finally, they came to a small, windowless room, its only furniture a metal table and 2 chairs. The agent motioned for Dylan to sit. Dylan did as instructed, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around and walk away. But he couldn't. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Agent Caldwell sat across from him, placing the briefcase on the table and opening it. You're probably wondering why we're involved in this, Caldwell began, his eyes never leaving Dylan's. The truth is, the situation with Zion Hayes is more complicated than you could ever imagine. What you've heard, what you've seen, it's all just the surface. Dylan swallowed hard, trying to process everything. What's going on? Why do you want me involved? Caldwell leaned forward, his voice low. Zion Hayes was involved in something far bigger than local corruption. He wasn't just a crooked cop, he was caught up in a web of criminal activity that stretches across the entire state. The investigation was about far more than just bribery and misconduct. It was about organized crime, smuggling, and, most importantly, the people he was working for. You see, Zion didn't leave the police force because of a scandal. He left because he couldn't protect his family anymore. The people he was involved with weren't just dangerous, they were lethal. Dylan's head spun as Caldwell continued. Zion was trying to escape. He came here, to Pine Hills, hoping to start over. He thought he could disappear, that no one would find him. But the problem is, when you're involved in something that deep, there's no escaping. They'll find you, and they'll do whatever it takes to silence you. Dylan could barely believe what he was hearing. His mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. Zion hadn't just been running from his past, he had been running from his life. The calm, silent man Dylan had come to view as a neighbor was hiding from something that threatened not just him, but everyone around him. We've been keeping tabs on him, Caldwell continued. But we need your help. Zion trusts you. And while we've been investigating him for months, we've never been able to get close enough. We need to know where he's hiding the evidence, Dylan. We need to know what he's keeping from us. Dylan's heart raced. He didn't know if he was ready for this. He didn't know if he was ready to betray Zion, to get involved in a web of crime and deceit that seemed far beyond anything he had ever imagined. But then he thought about the people he cared about, his family, his friends, this town, and the reality of the situation settled in. Zion Hayes wasn't just a former police chief. He was a man with a past far darker than Dylan had ever realized. And now, Dylan had to decide, would he help the agent uncover the truth, or would he stand by and watch the storm unfold, knowing that the consequences of inaction might destroy everything he held dear? The choice wasn't clear. But one thing was for certain, Dylan was no longer just a bystander. Pine Hills, and everything he thought he knew about it, had just been pulled into a world far beyond his comprehension. And now, there was no turning back, the crossroads. The weight of the decision hung heavy on Dylan's shoulders as he sat in the sterile room, Agent Caldwell's words echoing in his mind. Zion's life had been one of secrets and shadows, a world Dylan could barely comprehend, and yet here he was, dragged into it whether he liked it or not. His thoughts were clouded, torn between the loyalty he felt to his family, his community, and the undeniable pull of curiosity that burned inside him. What kind of person was Zion really? Was he the villain the government painted him to be, or was there a deeper, more complicated truth waiting to be uncovered? Dylan felt the walls closing in on him, the pressure mounting as Caldwell's eyes bore into him, waiting for a response. He could feel the agent's silent demand, make a choice. Now. But it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about right or wrong. There were people in Pine Hills who depended on him, people who knew nothing of the darkness Zion carried with him. What would they think if they knew that Dylan was being asked to help unravel a web of crime? Could he live with the consequences of his involvement? The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Dylan spoke, his voice shaky, but firm. What exactly do you want from me? What's the plan? Agent Caldwell didn't flinch. He was prepared for the question, his expression unchanging. He opened the briefcase again and slid a file across the table to Dylan, who hesitated before taking it. The file was thick, its contents clearly confidential, marked with the bold red stamp, top secret. Dylan opened the file slowly, his fingers trembling as he scanned the first few pages. What he read sent a chill down his spine. The file contained evidence of Zion's involvement in something far more dangerous than any local scandal. There were names, locations, cryptic notes, and details of operations that spanned across states. Zion hadn't just been a cop gone rogue, he had been part of something far bigger, an underground network that smuggled weapons, drugs, and more. But there was something else, something that didn't quite make sense. Zion had been trying to dismantle the organization from within, feeding information to authorities before he disappeared. The truth was murky, the lines between hero and villain too blurred to be easily defined. The people Zion worked with, Caldwell began, his voice a low murmur, they're not just criminals. They have connections that run deep, political, financial, even military. And they've been covering their tracks for years. We've been trying to bring them down for over a decade, but they're untouchable. That's where Zion comes in. We think he knows where the key evidence is hidden. We believe he's been playing a dangerous game, trying to protect his family and at the same time, trying to take them down. But he's also protecting something else, something important. Dylan's mind reeled. It was too much to process at once. Zion was more than just a man running from his past, he was a player in a much larger game, and Dylan was being asked to step into that world. He could already feel the consequences of such a choice weighing on him. And what if Zion doesn't want to help? Dylan asked, his voice hoarse with the enormity of the situation. Caldwell's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Dylan thought he saw something akin to hesitation in the agent's eyes. Zion's already made his choice. He just doesn't know it yet. Whether he admits it or not, he's in over his head. He can't keep running forever, and he can't protect his family without help. We're offering him that help, but we need you to get close. We need you to figure out where he's hiding the evidence, if he's hiding it at all. Dylan's gaze dropped to the file in front of him, the weight of it almost too much to bear. He could feel his pulse quicken, his anxiety rising as the reality of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about discovering the truth, it was about survival. Zion's life was entangled with forces that could bring down everything, and Dylan, now caught in the middle, was forced to choose sides. The agent's voice brought him back to the present. We've been watching Zion for months, but we've never gotten close enough. He's too careful, too smart. But he trusts you. He's let his guard down around you. That's why we need you, Dylan. You're the key to cracking this. Dylan's mind raced. Could he really go through with this? Could he betray Zion, a man who had shown nothing but restraint when Dylan had confronted him? He had already seen the vulnerability in Zion's eyes, the flicker of someone caught between two worlds. But now, Dylan was being asked to choose, to protect his community by helping the government bring down a criminal empire, or to stand by his neighbor, whose past was riddled with dangers beyond anything Dylan could fathom. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to calm the storm of thoughts crashing inside his head. The implications of either choice were monumental. He could expose Zion for the man he truly was, for all the crimes he had committed, and in doing so, bring peace to the town. Or he could keep silent, protect Zion's secrets, and risk everything, a decision that would undoubtedly alter the course of his life forever. Dylan had always thought of himself as an ordinary man, someone who lived quietly, worked hard, and tried to do right by others. He had never seen himself as someone capable of being involved in something like this. But now, standing at the crossroads, he realized that there was no way to stay out of it. The choice had already been made for him the moment Zion had moved next door. You have to understand something, Caldwell said, his voice low but urgent. This isn't just about Zion. This is about stopping something far larger than any of us. These people won't stop until they've destroyed everything, Zion, you, your family, this town. They'll do whatever it takes. Dylan's heart sank as the gravity of Caldwell's words took hold. He had been living in a bubble, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. Zion wasn't just a man with a troubled past, he was a pawn in a dangerous game, and Dylan was now trapped in that game. But there was one thing Dylan couldn't ignore. He couldn't sit idly by and watch as his town, his home, was torn apart by forces beyond his control. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. If Zion was really trying to bring down the organization, then Dylan had to help. He had to do whatever it took to stop this from spreading. Taking a deep breath, Dylan closed the file and pushed it back toward Agent Caldwell. His decision was made. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'll find out where he's hiding the evidence. I'll get close to him." Caldwell's expression softened, though there was no warmth in it. "You're making the right choice, Dylan. But you need to understand, once you're in this, there's no going back. There's no telling what will happen next. But we'll back you up. We'll keep you safe." Dylan nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. As he walked out of the room and back into the world he thought he knew, he realized that nothing would ever be the same. The truth, once uncovered, would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of his life, and possibly the future of Pine Hills itself. And as Dylan stepped into the unknown, he knew one thing for certain: the storm had only just begun.